4 hours and 11 minutes. That's what my ELD said I had left on my mandatory rest break. 4 hours and 11 minutes before I was legally allowed to move that truck. And whatever was outside, working its way down the row, testing every door handle, one truck at a time, was maybe 6 trucks away. I did the math. It wasn't in my favor. Subscribe before we go any further. There are 2 more stories after this one, and the last one ends 20 miles down the road with something in the mirror that I still can't account for. I want you to understand something about the hours of service rules before I tell you what happened. When you've used up your 11 hours of driving time, you stop, you park, you log off duty, and then you sit for a mandatory 10 hours before that clock resets. You can't move the truck. Your ELD records everything, every engine start, every mile. If you move before your 10 hours are up, it's a federal violation, fines, suspension, career over. So when I pulled into the Pilot truck stop outside Amarillo at 9:47 p.m. with 400 miles left in my head and 10 hours of nowhere to go, I wasn't thinking about anything except sleep. I backed into a spot in the east lot, away from the fuel islands, away from the restaurant lights, the dark end where the serious drivers park when they want quiet. About 30 other trucks around me, all dark, all still, everyone doing the same thing I was, waiting out the clock. I set my bunk alarm for 7 a.m., pulled the sleeper curtain, and was out in under 10 minutes. I woke up at 1:14 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place immediately. A click. Metallic. Close. I lay still and listened. Nothing for a long moment. Then another click, slightly different pitch, from a slightly different direction. I pulled the curtain back an inch and looked out at the lot. Dark. Still. The amber glow of the fuel island lights far across the lot, and between them and me, 30 parked semis sitting quiet under a sky with no moon. Then I heard it again. And this time I understood what it was. A door handle. Someone was testing a door handle on the truck 2 spaces down. Not knocking, not calling out, just the quiet, methodical sound of a handle being tried, pressed, held, released. Silence. Then footsteps moving, slow and deliberate, moving to the next truck. I watched through the gap in my curtain. I couldn't see anyone. The lot between the trucks was dark enough that whatever was moving through it wasn't catching any light, but I could track it by sound. The footsteps, then the pause, then the click of another handle being tested, working down the road toward me. I checked my ELD. 4 hours and 3 minutes remaining on my mandatory break. I want to tell you I had options. I want to tell you I could have just started the truck and driven away, violations and fines be damned. But the thing about being a trucker is that your CDL is your livelihood. Lose it and you lose everything. 4 hours felt survivable. Whatever was in that lot probably wasn't interested in a driver who was awake and watching. I told myself that. I counted the trucks between the sound and me. 6. The footsteps moved again. 5. I picked up my phone to call 911, then stopped. What was I going to say? Someone is trying door handles in a truck stop parking lot? That's not a crime. That might be another driver checking his own truck. I talked myself back from the edge and watched the clock tick down. 4 hours, 3 minutes. 4. 3 trucks away now. The sound of the handle in the dark was unhurried, almost gentle, the way you'd try a door if you were trying not to wake anyone. Press, hold, release. Footsteps. The gap between each truck, maybe 15 seconds of walking, then the next handle. 2 trucks away. My mouth was dry. I had my hand on my phone, but I wasn't calling anyone. I was watching the dark between my truck and the one next to me and trying to see something that wasn't catching light. 1 truck away. I heard the handle on the Kenworth beside me go down, pause, come back up. Then the footsteps again, slower this time, and I pressed myself back against the bunk and held completely still. My door handle moved, pressed down, held. The door didn't open. I'd locked it before I slept. Habit, I always lock it. But the handle moved, and I felt the tension of it through the cab. the slight shudder of someone testing resistance. Then it released. Silence. I waited for the footsteps to move on. They didn't. Whatever or whoever was outside my truck stayed there. No more handle, no sound at all. Just a stillness on the other side of my door that felt occupied in a way empty air doesn't. I watched the clock. 3 hours and 51 minutes. I didn't sleep again. I sat in that bunk with my back against the wall and my phone in my hand, and I watched the clock and listened to the silence outside my door for the rest of my break. At 7 a.m., when the ELD cleared and I was legal to move, I started that truck, pulled out of the spot, and didn't look at whatever might have been standing beside it. I checked my mirrors when I hit the highway. The lot was empty. No one moving. Just trucks parked in the dark, and one empty space where my rig had been. I still don't know what was out there. I still don't know how many of those other trucks had sleeping drivers inside them who heard the same sound and made the same calculation I did. What I do know is that I filed a note in my logbook that morning about what happened. Date, time, location, because it felt like the kind of thing that should exist somewhere in writing. 23 days later, talking to another driver at a fuel stop in New Mexico, I mentioned the pilot outside Amarillo. He went quiet. Then he said he'd parked there 6 months ago and woken up to the same sound, same pattern, same stillness outside his door that wouldn't move on. He'd been parked on mandatory rest too. Every trucker develops a relationship with their logbook over time. It becomes a kind of record of your life on the road, where you were, when you stopped, what the weather was doing. Some drivers write notes in the margins. Some keep it strictly factual. But all of it is yours. Your handwriting, your route, your story. The next driver found a logbook that had been filled in without him.
This happened on a Tuesday in late October. I need you to hold on to that detail, Tuesday, late October, because it matters at the end. I was running a load from Denver to Memphis, a route I'd done enough times that the truck stops along the way were as familiar as furniture. I pulled off I-40 around 2 a.m. in a small independent stop in the Oklahoma Panhandle. Not a chain, just a cinder block building with a fuel canopy and a gravel lot and a hand-painted sign that had been there since before I started driving. I needed coffee. That's it. 10 minutes, in and out. What I found in the lot stopped me before I even got to the door. A truck was parked at the far end of the gravel, away from the fuel pumps, engine off, lights dark, driver's door hanging open. Not ajar, open, fully, the way a door goes when someone gets out in a hurry and doesn't think to close it. The cab interior light was on, the way they go on automatically when the door opens, and in that faint dome light, I could see the cab was empty. I stood there for a moment. Then I walked over. The truck was cold. Engine had been off for a while, long enough that any warmth had bled out of it into the October night. The cab was tidy, organized, the kind of truck a careful driver keeps. The bunk curtain was open, coffee cup in the holder, still half full, cold. And on the passenger seat, open to the current page, the driver's paper logbook. I shouldn't have looked at it, I know that. A driver's logbook is private, it's professional, it's none of my business. But the door was open, and the light was on, and something about the scene felt wrong enough that I stood there and read the last entry anyway. The handwriting was neat. The day's log was filled in correctly. Departure time, route, fuel stop. And then, at the bottom of the entry, below where the formal log ended, a note in the margin. Not unusual, drivers do that. But this note ended mid-sentence. 3 words, then nothing. The pen line just stopped mid-stroke, like the hand holding it had simply ceased to exist. I stepped back from the truck. I went inside and got my coffee and told the woman behind the counter about the abandoned rig in the lot. She didn't look surprised. She said she'd call it in. I sat at the counter for 20 minutes, drank my coffee, watched the lot through the window. Nothing moved. The truck sat the way it had been when I found it. Door open, dome light on, cab empty. When I went back out to my truck, I walked past it one more time. I don't know why. Something pulled me back to it the way you slow down at an accident, not wanting to look, but looking anyway. The logbook was still on the passenger seat. The entry was complete. I stood there in the cold and read the last few lines 3 times before I was certain I wasn't misreading what I was seeing. The note in the margin, which had ended mid-sentence, was now finished. Several lines added below it in handwriting that wasn't quite the same as the original entries, slightly different pressure, slightly different letter formation, like someone who had studied the original handwriting and reproduced it carefully but not perfectly. The new lines described the truck stop, the gravel lot, the hand-painted sign, the woman behind the counter, the time, 2:17 a.m., which was approximately when I had arrived. The final line described a driver standing beside the open truck door in the October dark, reading a logbook by dome light. I was the only person who had been standing there. I didn't touch the book. I got in my truck, I pulled out of that lot, and I drove on I-40 for 2 hours without stopping because I needed the miles between me and that parking lot, and I needed to be somewhere with more light and more people before I let myself think about what I'd read. I reported it to the highway patrol the next morning. They found the truck. The driver, a man from Tulsa, 22 years on the road, no history of mental health issues, no financial problems, nothing that would explain a disappearance, was never found. The logbook was taken as evidence. I assume it's still in an evidence box somewhere. I assume whoever handled it read the last few entries. I don't know what they made of the final line. I do know this. The note in the margin, which had ended mid-sentence, was about something the driver had seen in the lot and wanted to write down before he went to investigate. It ended on the word outside. There are things on the road that take people. That much seems true. And some things are more patient than that. Things that are content to be present, to be close, to let you know they're there and let you live with the knowing. The last driver in tonight's stories got 20 miles down the road before he understood what kind of thing he was dealing with.
I am not someone who spooks easily. I want to put that on record because I know how this story sounds, and I know what people think when a trucker says he got scared in his own cab. I've been driving for 16 years. I've broken down in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. I've driven through storms that closed the road behind me. I've had passengers in the jump seat who turned out to be a lot more complicated than they presented themselves. None of that touched me the way one ordinary Tuesday night did. I stopped at the Flying J outside Joplin, Missouri. A big, busy truck stop. Nothing isolated about it. Fuel islands running all night, a Denny's attached, the kind of place where you never feel alone. I went in for dinner, 45 minutes, sat at the counter, ate, paid, came back out. My truck was exactly where I'd left it, locked, nothing visibly wrong. But something was different. I noticed it before I could name it. Something about the way the cab sat, something that didn't resolve into language for a few seconds while I stood in the parking lot looking at my truck, trying to understand what my eyes were telling me. Then I had it. The sleeper curtain. I always close it. Not most of the time, always. It's habit, the same way you check your mirrors, the same way you check your load. Every time I leave the truck, I close that curtain completely. It's dark fabric, and it cuts the cab in half, and I close it. It wasn't closed. It was open about 8 inches. I told myself I had forgotten. First time for everything. I unlocked the door, climbed in, checked the cab out of habit, glove box normal, sleeper curtain moved aside fully now as I looked into the bunk. Nothing. Empty. The way I left it. I pulled out of the lot and got back on I-44 headed east. I drove for 20 minutes with the radio on low, the kind of driving where your body does the work and your mind drifts. 20 miles from Joplin. Traffic thin, mostly dark road, a few sets of headlights moving the other direction.
I checked my mirrors. The curtain was open again. Not all the way, the same 8 inches, the same gap it had been when I came back to the truck. I had pushed it all the way open when I checked the sleeper, I was certain of that. And now it was back to that precise 8-inch gap, like something on the other side of it had let it fall back to exactly where it wanted it. I didn't look away from the road. I kept my speed steady. Every part of me was focused on the white lines ahead, the sound of the engine, and the feeling of the steering wheel under my hands. I said, out loud, in a completely level voice, "If someone is in that sleeper, I need you to say something right now." The road went by. The white lines, the dark fields on either side, nothing from behind the curtain. I said, "I'm going to pull over at the next rest area and I'm going to call the police. If you're back there, this is the time." Silence. The curtain didn't move. I pulled to the rest area. I left the engine running, got out of the truck, went around to the passenger side and opened the sleeper door from the outside. Empty. Bunk made the way I'd left it. Nothing displaced, nothing moved, nothing that hadn't been there when I left Joplin. I stood there with the door open and the cold Missouri air coming in and looked at the sleeper for a long time. The curtain was open 8 inches. I closed it. Completely, the way I always do, pressed it flat against the frame until there was no gap, got back in the cab, locked all the doors, and sat there in that rest area for 20 minutes before I felt calm enough to drive. I pulled back onto I-44, drove another 15 miles, checked my mirror at a routine moment, the kind of check you do without thinking about it, just eyes going to the glass out of habit. The curtain was open 8 inches. I didn't stop again. I drove the rest of the way to my delivery. 4 more hours, straight through, no rest stops, no fuel breaks, eyes on the road and one hand on the wheel, and every few minutes the mirror showing me the same gap in that same dark curtain that I had closed twice now, and that kept returning to exactly 8 inches, like something on the other side had a preference. I have never been able to explain it. I have never been able to look at that gap long enough to see if there was anything in the dark behind it. I'm not sure I want to know. 3 stops, 3 different wrongs. If you drive for a living, if you've ever sat in a dark parking lot at 3 a.m. and heard something you couldn't account for, or come back to your truck and known before you opened the door that something was different, leave it in the comments. This channel exists for exactly those stories. Subscribe if you haven't. We're building something here, and the road gets darker from here.